The moment I stepped through the airlock, 300 alien eyes turned toward me, and not one of them looked impressed. I want to be honest about that. There was no dramatic music, no sweeping lights, no sense that history was being made. There was only the low hum of a ventilation system calibrated for species that breathe methane, and the faint sounds of something clicking in a language I had not yet learned to identify. The Grand Conclave of the Galactic Cooperative was exactly as massive as the briefing files had described, and the files had been very clear. I was going to be the least important person in the room. My name is Marcus Vale. I was 38 years old. I had spent 11 years negotiating water rights between competing municipal governments in Central Europe, 4 years mediating trade disputes for the United Earth Economic Board, and roughly 6 months vomiting on a deep space transport vessel, because no one had told me that hyperspace travel feels exactly like being turned inside out, held there for a moment, and then slowly returned to your original shape with a slight error. I was not a soldier, I was not a scientist. I was not famous. I was, according to the formal letter of appointment sitting folded in my jacket pocket, Earth's diplomatic representative to the Galactic Cooperative, provisional status, pending review. Provisional. They put that word in writing. I thought about that a lot during the journey. The chamber itself was circular, which I had expected, and enormous, which I had also expected. But what I had not expected was how clearly the seating arrangement communicated everything about political power without a single word being spoken. The innermost ring of seats was wide, cushioned, and equipped with translation terminals that gleamed under soft lighting. The middle ring was smaller. The outer ring, where I was directed by a four-armed attendant who never made eye contact with me, had chairs that looked like they had been designed as an afterthought. Mine in particular seemed built for a species with a different number of legs than I possessed. I sat down carefully, adjusted my jacket, and began counting species. It is something I do in unfamiliar rooms. I count things. I catalog. It is not a skill that sounds impressive at dinner parties, but it has gotten me through more difficult negotiations than I care to admit. You learn more from watching a room than from listening to it, at least in the early stages. And what I watched, in those first minutes in the Grand Conclave, told me quite a lot. The Vreth occupied 4 seats in the innermost ring. They were tall, but laterally symmetrical, with smooth gray-violet skin and eyes that were large and almost entirely dark. They moved with the kind of measured, deliberate grace that I had come to associate, over years of observation, with species or people who had never once been told that they were wrong about anything. Their equipment was the best in the room. Their translator units were newer models than anyone else's. When the head of their delegation, a figure I had been briefed on as Ambassador Cavaldros, glanced in my direction, it was with the specific look a person gives to a piece of furniture that has been placed somewhere inconvenient. I smiled at him. He looked away. The session opened with a formal address by the conclave's presiding officer, a being of the mer species who I will describe simply as vast, slow-moving, and ancient-looking, with a voice that came through the translation system as something between a deep bell and rainfall on stone. The address was procedural. New member admissions, pending motions, scheduled reviews. My name was read aloud near the end of the list, in the section labeled Provisional Admissions under Ongoing Review. And I heard the clicking language again from somewhere to my left. I did not look immediately. I made a note of the direction and kept my eyes forward. There is a technique I learned early in my career. When you are the smallest person in the room, you do not look small. You do not shrink into your chair or avoid eye contact or speak too quickly or apologize for your presence. You sit exactly as though you belong there, because the moment you signal that you believe you do not, everyone else in the room will agree with you, and then you will never recover the ground you gave away. So I sat in that poorly designed chair in the outer ring of the most powerful political body in the known galaxy, and I sat as though I had chosen that specific chair for specific reasons of my own, and I listened. The first motion of the session was routine, a trade dispute between 2 species in the outer Meridian cluster. The Vreth delegation weighed in immediately, offering a solution that was technically fair and practically tilted in their favor. No one challenged it. The motion passed. I wrote one word in my notebook, pattern. The second motion involved a request from a species called the Sulhari to renegotiate the terms of a resource-sharing agreement. A member of the Sulhari delegation, a small, quick-moving person with pale green skin and wide amber eyes, stood to make the request. She was interrupted twice before she finished her opening sentence. The first interruption came from the Vreth. The second came from a larger species in the second ring whose name I did not yet know. The Sulhari representative sat back down without completing her statement. The motion was tabled indefinitely. I wrote a second word in my notebook, pressure. Then came the third motion, and this one was about me. Ambassador Dross of the Vreth stood. He was very good at standing. It was the kind of standing that occupied space in a particular way, that said without words that the person doing it considered the room to belong to them. He adjusted something on his translation unit and began to speak, and his words came through mine with perfect clarity and a tone that was, unmistakably, the tone of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. He said that the Galactic Cooperative had a long tradition of careful admission standards. He said that membership in the cooperative was not merely a status, but a responsibility, and that responsibility required certain qualities of civilization, restraint, and stability. He said that Earth had been granted provisional status, not because it had demonstrated these qualities, but because the cooperative valued optimism about the potential of developing species. He paused there. He let that word, developing, settle into the room like a stone dropping into still water. Then he said that recent observational data from Earth's own historical records, submitted as part of the admission application, raised serious concerns about whether humanity was, at this time, prepared for the weight of cooperative membership. He used the phrase biological instability. He used the phrase historically self-destructive behavioral patterns. He spoke for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and when he was done, the chamber hummed in a way that I had already started to recognize as the sound of general agreement. Then he tabled a formal motion, the suspension of Earth's provisional seat, pending a full civilizational review process that his own estimation placed at a minimum of 40 years. 40 years. I wrote a third word in my notebook. I will not write it here because it is not appropriate for formal record, but the sentiment was clear. The presiding officer asked if there were any responses before the motion was opened for deliberation. There was a pause. I felt the eyes on me from the center rings, the kind of eyes that were waiting to see if the small creature from the outer ring was going to do something embarrassing. I stood up. I will say this, the chair made a noise when I pushed it back that was louder than I intended. But I stood, and I straightened my jacket, and I said, through the translation unit, that I would like to respond to the motion. The presiding officer granted me 3 minutes. 3 minutes to answer 40 years. I thanked the ambassador for his thorough presentation. I said that Earth appreciated the cooperative's concern for its own standards. I said that I understood the data was alarming to species who had not had the opportunity to study it in context. And then I said something that I had not planned to say, because I had been in the room for less than 2 hours, and had already seen enough to understand what kind of room it was. I said that I would like, at the next session, to offer a full contextual presentation on Earth's history, if the cooperative would permit it. Not a defense, not an apology. A presentation. I said that context was, in my experience, the difference between a problem and a misunderstanding. I said that I believed the cooperative was too wise to make a 40-year decision on incomplete information. Dross looked at me across the chamber with an expression that I recognized because I had seen it many times before in many different rooms on many different planets. It was the expression of someone who was confident they had already won, and who was therefore mildly curious about what the other party thought they were doing. He did not object to the presentation request. The motion was entered for deliberation. I sat back down in my inconvenient chair. From somewhere to my left, in the direction of that clicking language I still had not identified, I felt someone watching me. Not with the cool dismissal of the inner rings, with something else. I did not look yet. I made a note. I kept my face calm and my breathing even, and I thought about the room, and what it needed, and how much time I had. 3 minutes had bought me at least one more session. That was enough for now. In my experience, one more session is all you ever really need. I wrote a fourth word in my notebook, beginning. The conclave reconvened 6 days later. Those 6 days were not wasted. I want to explain something about how I work, because it matters for everything that comes after. I do not panic. I know that sounds like the sort of thing people say about themselves when they want to sound impressive, but I am not saying it to sound impressive. I am saying it because it is a functional description of how my mind operates under pressure, and understanding it will help you understand what happened in that chamber, and what happened after. When other people panic, they narrow. Their thinking gets smaller. They focus on the immediate threat, and they stop seeing the room around the threat. I do the opposite. When pressure increases, my attention gets wider. I start noticing more things, not fewer. I start seeing connections between things I would normally treat as separate. My breathing slows. My heart rate drops. A physician once told me this was unusual. I told her it was probably a family trait. She said that was not how physiology worked. I did not argue the point. Those 6 days between sessions I studied. I read every file I had been given on every species in the conclave. I read the public record of every vote taken in the cooperative in the past 20 years. I mapped the alliances, the counter-alliances, the abstentions, the motions that died in committee. I ate meals alone in my assigned quarters, and I read, and I thought, and I made lists. The Vreth had been a dominant force in the cooperative for over 3 centuries. In that time, they had shaped the trade agreements, the admission standards, the conflict resolution protocols, all of it bearing their influence in ways that were legal, technically fair, and thoroughly self-serving. They had never done anything that could be called a violation. They had simply been present and patient and strategic in every room where decisions were made for 300 years. I understood that. I respected it, in the way you respect a chess player who has been winning the same game for so long, that they have stopped expecting anyone to play differently. I was going to play differently. On the 4th day, the Sulhari ambassador found me in the corridor outside the translation services office. Her name was Lyra Voss, which I discovered later was a name she had chosen specifically for interactions with human diplomats, because her actual name was not producible by human vocal anatomy. She was small, quick, and she moved like someone who had learned very early to keep the exits in sight. She said, "You are still here." I said, "I live here for now." She looked at me for a moment in the way that I would come to recognize as Sulhari. Assessment, a rapid comprehensive evaluation that happened mostly through stillness. Then she said, "They expected you to go home." I told her I had not been given return transport. She made a sound that the translator rendered as something between a laugh and a skeptical click. She said, "That is either very unfortunate or very convenient." I told her that in my experience, those two things were frequently the same. She sat down on a bench in the corridor, which surprised me because the bench was small and the corridor was public and Sulhari diplomats were, according to my files, extremely private. She looked at me and said, "What are you going to say in the session?" I sat down beside her. I said, "The truth," she said. "The truth about what?" I said, "About what humanity is." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I wrote down immediately after the conversation ended, because I did not want to forget it. She said, "They do not know what they provoked. I hope you understand that. They pushed you because they push everyone, and everyone moves. They do not know what happens when something does not move." I told her I was not planning to be immovable. I was planning to be something more useful than that. She looked at me again. Then she said, "I will listen to your presentation." She left. I sat in the corridor for another few minutes, thinking about the room. On the 6th day, I prepared my materials. I did not use a single image of a weapon, a battlefield, a destroyed city, or anything that could be called frightening. I used charts, data sets, timelines, the kind of presentation that looks, at first glance, like a very thorough accounting report. The session opened and the presiding Mir gave the floor to me. I stood at the center terminal, which I had specifically requested, and which had been granted with visible reluctance, and I said that I wanted to thank the cooperative for the opportunity to provide context. I said that I was going to present data, and that the data would speak for itself, and that I asked only for the courtesy of allowing the presentation to complete before deliberation began. The Vreth delegation did not object. Dross was watching me with that same expression of patient confidence. I began. I started with a simple number. The number was 0. I told the chamber that humanity had experienced 0 years of complete total, global peace since the beginning of recorded history. There was a murmur through the chamber. I let it pass. Then I said that I wanted to be very clear about what that number meant, and what it did not mean. I showed the first chart. It tracked the number of distinct military conflicts on Earth over the past 3,000 years. The line did not go down, but I asked them to look at something else in the chart, a secondary line, which tracked the average duration of those conflicts. That line went down, significantly. Every century the conflicts got shorter, not because humans were fighting less, but because they were getting better at ending conflict, faster, with more precision. I showed the second chart. This one tracked technological advancement indexed against periods of conflict. I explained what the cooperative probably already knew in theory, but had perhaps not examined in practice. That human civilization had developed, tested, and discarded more military technologies in the past 200 years than in the previous 2,000. I explained that this was not because humans enjoyed destruction. It was because each conflict revealed a flaw in a previous system, and humans, as a species, have a deep and consistent compulsion to fix flaws. I said we do not end conflicts by ignoring them. We end them by understanding them completely. And then we make sure they cannot happen the same way again. The chamber was quieter than I had expected. I showed the third chart. This one required more explanation. It tracked something that is harder to quantify: institutional learning. Every major conflict in human history had produced a response. Not just military, but legal, political, structural. After enough destruction, humans had built international courts, humanitarian law, economic interdependence agreements, multilateral security frameworks. None of these were perfect. I said so directly, but each one represented something that I told the chamber I considered remarkable. A species that kept trying to solve a problem it had not yet fully solved, generation after generation, without giving up. Dross made a sound. His translator rendered it as a formal clearing of attention, which is the Vreth equivalent of an interruption signal. He said that the presentation was informative, but that the data confirmed his original concern. Humanity was a species defined by conflict, and a species defined by conflict was not suited to a cooperative built on peace. I looked at him, I said calmly, "Ambassador, with respect, I would like to point out that the cooperative itself was founded following a conflict. The founding accord of the cooperative, which I have read in full, begins with the phrase, having learned from the cost of disunity. That implies that the cooperative's founders had experienced disunity. That implies they had conflicts of their own." The chamber was very still. I said, "I am not presenting humanity's history as a record of failure. I am presenting it as a record of learning. Every species in this room learned something that brought them here. We learned it the same way. We simply learned it faster, under worse conditions, and we are still learning." I paused. I looked around the chamber, not at the center ring, but at the outer rings, where the smaller delegations sat. I had spent 6 days reading their files too. I said, "Humanity did not come to this cooperative because we have finished becoming what we are trying to become. We came because we understood finally that some problems are too large for one species to solve alone. I suspect that is why most of the species in this room came as well." I stepped back from the terminal. The chamber did not applaud. That was fine. The presiding Mer opened deliberation, and the motion to expel Earth passed by a margin of 16 votes, with 41 abstentions. Earth's seat was officially suspended, but Lyra Voss did not vote for the expulsion, and 11 other delegations abstained who had previously been expected to vote in favor. As I walked out of the chamber, I passed close to the Sulhari section, and Lyra did not look at me, which meant, in Sulhari social code, that she was paying very close attention. I had read that in the files. Outside the main doors, in the wide corridor that ringed the chamber, I stopped and looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was very high, and the material it was made of caught light in a way that was almost beautiful. Then I felt someone stop beside me. I turned. It was a diplomat I did not recognize, from a delegation I had catalogued as the Hanari, a species with 4 eyes, 2 sets, arranged vertically on an elongated head, with deep blue skin and hands that moved constantly as though thinking and gesture were the same process. He was young, I thought, or whatever the Hanari equivalent of young was. He said quietly, "That was a good presentation," I said. "The motion still passed." He said, "Yes, but you changed 41 votes in 6 days without saying a single word that was not true." I looked at him. He looked back at me with 2 of his 4 eyes, which I had read was the Hanari equivalent of a direct gaze. He said, "How long are you staying?" I said. "I have not been given return transport." He made a sound that the translator rendered as something very close to a human laugh. He said, "Then I will see you in the corridors." He walked away. I stood there a moment longer. 41 abstentions, 16 votes against, and I had been in the building for less than 2 weeks. I went back to my quarters and opened a new page in my notebook. I did not write a word. I drew a circle, and then I drew lines connecting different points on the circle, and I sat and I looked at it, and I thought about rooms, and time, and the particular patience that is required when you are playing a long game in a building full of people who do not yet understand that there is a long game being played. I was not angry about the vote. Anger is expensive. It costs energy you need for other things. I was instead interested. I was interested in the 41. I was interested in what they had read in my presentation, what they had seen between the numbers. I was interested in the Sulhari ambassador, who chose not to vote against a species she had known for less than 2 weeks, and the young Hanari diplomat who had thought to say something kind to a person walking out of a defeat. I was interested in the Vreth too, in Dross, in particular. In the way his confidence had a texture to it that I had seen before, not in arrogant people, but in people who were afraid of what would happen if they admitted they might be wrong. That was a different thing. That was something I knew how to work with. I closed my notebook. I was not going home. The suspension of Earth's seat came with a formal notice that I was to be treated as a non-member observer, which meant I retained my access badge, my quarters, my translation unit, and my right to attend open sessions as a silent party. What it did not restrict was the one thing the Vreth had apparently not thought to restrict: my right to exist in corridors, eat in shared dining areas, sit in public spaces, and talk to people. I want to say this plainly, because I think it is important. The Vreth made a very small oversight in their motion, and that small oversight was the only opening I needed. I started the morning after the vote with a simple task. I went to breakfast. The diplomatic quarters shared dining facility was large and always occupied by someone, at every hour, because the cooperative's member species observed many different diurnal cycles. I arrived at what was, for me, early morning, and for 3 other species in the room, midday, evening, and the functional equivalent of 3 in the morning, respectively. I chose a table near the center and I ate and I watched. On the second morning, I chose a table closer to the Sulhari section of the room. Lyra Voss was there. I nodded. She looked at her food, which again, in Sulhari social code, meant she had noticed me and was willing to continue noticing me. On the third morning, I sat at the Sulhari table. She looked up and said, "You are very direct for someone who lost." I said, "I prefer to think of it as pending." She said, "Pending for 40 years. I said, "The review timeline was the Vreth's proposal. It was not voted on." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want?" I told her the truth. I said, "I want to know what you know about the resource agreement that was tabled in the first session, the one you were trying to renegotiate." Her expression changed, not dramatically, but I was watching closely. She said, "That is a different conversation." I said, "I have time." She looked at me again with that comprehensive Sulhari stillness. Then she said, "Not here." We met later in one of the small rooms the cooperative maintained for informal consultations, a featureless space with a table, 4 chairs, and no recording equipment, which I had verified independently before the meeting. Lyra brought another member of her delegation, a older Sulhari named Davan Ori, who had been with the cooperative for decades, and who watched me throughout our conversation with an expression I could only describe as carefully withheld judgment. She told me about the agreement. The original resource-sharing compact between the Sulhari and the Vreth had been signed 40 years ago, under terms that the Sulhari had accepted, because they had no alternatives at the time. The compact gave the Vreth preferential access to 3 mineral-rich systems in Sulhari space, in exchange for military protection. The protection had been real, initially. Over time, the Vreth's military presence in those systems had quietly transformed from protective to something else, something that was technically within the letter of the compact but thoroughly contrary to its spirit. I listened. I asked questions. I did not offer opinions or make promises. When she finished, I asked if she had documentation. She said, "We have everything. We have had everything for 12 years. We bring the motion to renegotiate every session. Every session it gets interrupted, tabled, or voted down." I asked her why she thought that was. She looked at Davan Ori. He looked at the table. She said, "Because 9 other species in the cooperative have similar agreements with the Vreth. And none of them want to be the first to say so." I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked if I could see the documentation. "Not to use immediately. Just to see," she said. "Why would I show a non-member observer the most sensitive files my government possesses?" I said, "Because I sat in a room full of 300 species 3 days ago and did not say a single thing that was not true. And I think you noticed that." Davan Ori made a sound. His translator did not render it as a word, but his expression suggested it was something between surprise and reluctant. Amusement. Lyra looked at me for a very long time. Then she said, "I will share a summary, not the original files." I said that was more than enough to start. I want to pause here and explain something that I think gets misunderstood about diplomatic work, which is that most of it looks, from the outside, like nothing. It looks like people sitting in rooms and having quiet conversations. It looks like meals and corridor meetings and small questions asked in careful tones. It does not look like the thing it actually is, which is the gradual, methodical process of building a structure that does not yet exist, using materials that people do not yet know they are willing to give you. Over the next 2 weeks, I had 47 conversations. I tracked them all in my notebook. Not their contents, not the names of who I spoke to, but the nature of each conversation. What the other person wanted, what they were afraid of, what they had that they did not realize was valuable. The Hanari diplomat, whose name I eventually learned was Pip Noor, met me twice more and introduced me informally to a colleague from the Vethani delegation. The Vethani were a quiet species, small in number, who had been cooperative members for over a century, and had spent most of that time trying not to attract attention. They had a great deal of information and no particular forum in which to use it. I gave them a forum, or rather, I began quietly building one. There is a procedural rule in the cooperative that I had found on the 14th page of the appendix to the membership charter in a section that was clearly written as a formality and had not been meaningfully invoked in over 200 years. The rule stated that any non-member observer who possessed documented evidence of a treaty violation involving 3 or more member states had the right to table an emergency motion for formal review, bypassing the standard committee process. It was not a large loophole. It was barely even a door, but it was there, and it was real, and it was mine. On day 17, I received an anonymous data package in my quarters. The delivery system used an internal cooperative channel that technically should not have had my address on its routing list. I did not know who sent it. I looked at the contents carefully. Then I looked at them again. I sat very still for a long time. The package contained records that the Vreth had been careful to keep out of any public registry. Files that showed the operational history of something that had been built quietly over the past 30 years, in a system that appeared on no official chart. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a tool of control, one designed not to destroy but to compromise. A system capable of inducing catastrophic cascading failures in the atmospheric processors of a Class M inhabited planet, which would not look like an attack, which would look like a technical malfunction, and which had been used before, twice, on species that had been in the process of challenging Vreth interests and had then suddenly become much more cooperative. 2 species, 2 events, 12 and 19 years ago, both ruled as equipment failures. I closed the file. I did not panic. My breathing slowed. My thinking got wider. I thought about the room. I thought about what the room needed. I thought about the 41 abstentions, and Lyra Voss, and Pip Noor, and the quiet Vethany Diplomat who had more information than he had ever been able to use. I thought about the small loophole in the 14th page of the appendix. I thought about timing. I opened a new page in my notebook and I began to write, not words, a structure, a sequence, a plan built on what I actually had, not on what I wished I had, which is the only kind of plan that is worth making. It took me most of the night. When I was done, I looked at it carefully, found 3 points where it could fail, addressed all 3, and then went to sleep. In the morning, I sent a message to Lyra Voss. The message contained 4 words, "Are you ready to speak?" Her reply came in 11 minutes. It contained 3 words, "Since 12 years." I filed the emergency motion on a Tuesday, which was not a particularly significant day for most species in the cooperative, but which happened to be the morning of a scheduled full session, meaning that every delegation would already be present when the motion hit the procedural queue. I want to describe the moment the motion appeared on the session board, because I watched it happen from my seat in the outer ring, and it was, in its own quiet way, one of the most satisfying things I have ever witnessed. There is a display panel above the presiding officer's position that lists the session agenda in real time. The items on it that morning were routine, 3 trade questions and a membership review for a species in the far spiral. Then, between the 2nd and 3rd trade questions, a new item appeared, labeled in the cooperative standard formatting as an emergency procedural invocation, non-member observer, pending verification. Dross did not notice it immediately. I was watching him when he did. He was speaking quietly to the Vreth diplomat beside him, and then something in his posture changed, a very small change, like a door closing quietly somewhere deep in a house, and he looked at the board, and then he looked at me. I looked back at him. I did not smile. I did not look away. The presiding Mer read the motion into the record. Formal charges, submitted under Appendix Provision 14 of the Cooperative Membership Charter, citing documented evidence of treaty manipulation, coercive agreement enforcement, and coordinated interference with the internal stability of member species against the Vreth Empire, supported by testimony from 9 member delegations. 9 delegations, 4 more than I had confirmed as of the previous evening. Someone had made a decision overnight. The chamber went from its usual working hum to a different quality of silence. It was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of people choosing very carefully when to say it. Dross stood. He was very good at standing. I had established this, but something was different about the way he stood now. The weight of it was off. He said, with perfect formal composure, that the motion was procedurally irregular, that a non-member observer had no legitimate standing to invoke emergency provisions, and that he requested an immediate ruling from the presiding officer to strike the motion from the agenda. The presiding Mer said, in that slow voice that sounded like rainfall on stone, that the provision in question did not require member status, only documented evidence and observer accreditation. He said that the motion would proceed to preliminary review. Dross said that the evidence cited had not been verified. The presiding Mer said that verification was the purpose of the review. Dross said that the motion was politically motivated. I requested the floor. It was granted. I stood at my position in the outer ring, which was considerably farther from the center terminal than I would have liked, but I had a translation unit and a clear voice, and I said, calmly, that the ambassador was correct that I had motivations. I said that my motivation was to present documented information to a body that existed, specifically for the purpose of addressing documented concerns among its members. I said that if that was political, then the cooperative's own charter was political, and I was willing to let the chamber make that determination. There was that quality of silence again. Lyra Voss stood. She identified herself and her delegation, and she said that the Sulhari government formally supported the emergency motion and requested that its own documentation, compiled over 12 years, be entered into the review record. Then Pip Noor stood and the Vethani diplomat stood, and then, one by one, 7 other delegations indicated support, including 2 that I had not approached, had not spoken to, had not included in any plan. They had decided on their own. I sat down. Dross said something to the Vreth diplomat beside him that the translation unit did not catch, because it was spoken below broadcast level, but I watched his face and I understood the general meaning. He requested a recess. It was granted 40 minutes. During the recess, 2 Vreth officials approached me in the outer corridor. They were not the kind of officials who attend to diplomatic details. They were large and they moved in a particular way, the way that says position and purpose, without needing to be specific about the nature of that purpose. One of them told me that the motion was based on fabricated information, and that if I proceeded with it, the consequences for Earth's application would be severe. I said, Earth's application is currently suspended. It cannot get more suspended. He said, there are consequences that are not procedural. I looked at him, I said, I am aware of that. Thank you. Then I went and stood near the window at the end of the corridor and looked at the exterior view, which was the surface of a planet I still had not learned the name of, far below, covered in something that might have been cloud, or might have been something else entirely. And I breathed, and I thought, and I waited for the recess to end. The session reconvened. The preliminary review was formally opened. The evidence was entered into the record. The Vreth delegation made 3 further objections, each of which the presiding Mer addressed with the same patient, settled authority. At the end of the session, the presiding Mer announced that the evidence would be reviewed by an independent committee of 7 senior member delegations, with a full session hearing scheduled in 3 days. As the chamber emptied, I remained in my seat for a while. The outer ring cleared quickly. Most of the inner delegations filed out in groups, talking in their various languages and translated tones, and I sat and I listened to the room getting quiet. Lyra Voss paused beside me on her way out. She did not stop walking, she said, without looking at me, in a voice low enough that only my translator caught it. You should eat something. You look like you have not slept. I told her I had slept fine, she said. You are a very strange person, Marcus Vale. I said, I have been told. She walked on. I sat for another minute, and then I stood, and I walked out of the chamber, and I took the long way back to my quarters, because the long way past the main observation deck, and I wanted to look at the stars for a few minutes, just because they were there. I had filed a motion in a room full of people who had spent 300 years learning not to challenge the dominant power, and 9 of them had stood up anyway, 2 of them without being asked. That mattered more than the motion. The motion was a procedural tool. The 9 delegations were something else. They were evidence that the room was capable of being different than it had been, which is the only evidence that ever really matters in any room. I looked at the stars. Then I went back to my quarters and ate something, because Lyra was right, and I have always found it useful to take good advice when it is offered. The independent committee's report came back in 2.5 days, not 3, which told me something important. They had found what I told them they would find, and it had not taken them long. The full hearing was scheduled. The chamber was at maximum capacity in a way I had not seen since the first session. I had a seat in the outer ring, the same uncomfortable chair, and I sat in it with the same deliberate posture as the first day, because some things are worth being consistent about. The Vreth delegation arrived in full. Dross was at the center of their group, and he had brought 3 additional officials who had not been present in previous sessions, senior figures, whose names I knew from my research. This was a significant concession, whether they meant it as one or not. Senior officials do not attend hearings they expect to win easily. They attend the difficult ones. The presiding Mer read the committee's preliminary findings into the record. The language was formal and careful, which is the language that independent committees always use, but the meaning was clear. The evidence was credible, the pattern was documented, and the concerns raised by the emergency motion were substantiated enough to proceed to full deliberation. Dross requested the right to address the chamber before deliberation opened. It was granted. He stood. He said that the committee's report was based on materials of questionable provenance. He said that the Vreth Empire had been a member of the cooperative in good standing for over 3 centuries, and that its record spoke for itself. He said that the emergency motion was a coordinated attempt by a small number of delegations to use a marginal procedural mechanism to advance a political agenda. Then he said something that I had been waiting for, something I had suspected he would say because people in his position, when they feel cornered, always say it. He said that the entire process had been orchestrated by an outsider, a representative of a species whose own fitness for civilized membership was still under review, a species with a documented history of aggression and self-destruction, and that the cooperative should be deeply skeptical of allowing that influence to shape its proceedings. He looked at me when he said it. He was very good at looking at people. It was a look designed to make the target feel small and visible at the same time. I stood up. The presiding Mer looked at me. I said quietly that I would like to respond. He granted it. I walked to the central terminal. I had not asked for it this time. I had simply walked to it, and the room let me, and I stood there and I looked at Dross. And then I looked at the chamber, and I said that I wanted to speak not about the evidence, because the committee had addressed the evidence, and not about procedure, because the presiding officer had addressed procedure, but about something that Ambassador Dross had raised, which I thought deserved a direct response. I said. The ambassador has suggested that this process should be distrusted because it was initiated by a representative of humanity, and that humanity's history of conflict makes that representation inherently suspect. I paused. I said, I would like to offer a different way of looking at that. The chamber was very still. I said, I come from a species that has been in some form of conflict, somewhere on its planet, for the entirety of its recorded history. The ambassador is correct about that. He is also correct that humanity caused enormous damage to itself through those conflicts. Many species in this room know the same truth about their own pasts, because the cooperative was not founded by species who had never experienced conflict. It was founded by species who had experienced enough of it to understand what it costs. I said, what I would ask this chamber to consider is not whether humanity has a history of conflict. We do. What I would ask you to consider is what we learned from it. We learned to document. We learned to build institutions that could hold power accountable, even when that power was very large and very old and very confident that it would never be challenged. We built courts. We built review bodies. We built exactly the kind of mechanism that this chamber is using right now, to look at evidence and ask whether something that was done in darkness deserves to be examined in the light. I said, that is not a primitive instinct. That is not aggression. That is, in my understanding, exactly what the cooperative was designed to do. I stepped back from the terminal. The Mer xenobiologist who had been scanning me since the first session, a figure I had noticed but never spoken to, submitted something to the presiding officer's panel at that moment. I did not know what it was at the time. I learned later. Deliberation opened. It ran for 4 hours. I sat in my uncomfortable chair and I listened to 300 species argue, in their various languages, about evidence and precedent and the nature of power and the meaning of accountability. At several points, delegations that I had never spoken to made arguments that sounded like the arguments I would have made. They had arrived at them independently. I found that more satisfying than anything I had personally said. The vote came at the end of the 4th hour. The Vreth weapon program was to be immediately disclosed, dismantled, and placed under cooperative inspection. The coercive agreements with the 9 affected species were to be formally reviewed and renegotiated under independent mediation. A standing oversight committee was to be established for the first time in cooperative history, with rotating membership drawn from mid-tier delegations rather than the dominant powers. Earth's provisional seat was restored, not by a narrow margin, by 212 votes to 41, with 11 abstentions. The restored seat, furthermore, was assigned a new position, not the outer ring, the second ring. The presiding Mer read this as a procedural accommodation given Earth's demonstrated contribution to cooperative process, and the chamber received it in a way that I could only describe as complicated, which seemed appropriate. Because it was. I sat in my outer ring seat for the announcement, because no one had moved the furniture yet, and I did not stand up or change my expression. Dross looked at me once, across the chamber, with an expression I had not seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was something more considered than that, something almost like reassessment. After the session closed, as the chamber emptied and I remained seated, waiting for the room to clear before I moved, someone sat down in the chair beside me. I looked over. It was the xenobiologist. She was from the Mer species, which meant she was vast and slow-moving and ancient-looking, and sitting in a chair that was scaled for smaller species made her look somewhat uncomfortable, but she sat anyway. Her name, the translator told me, was something that had no phonetic equivalent in any human language, but she introduced herself by saying I could call her Sever, which was the closest the translator could approximate. She said, I have been monitoring your physiological readings since the first session. I said I noticed. She said you noticed and you did not object. I said I had nothing to hide. She said that is interesting in itself. She set something on the arm of my chair, a data card. She said, this is the report I submitted to the presiding officer during your address. I thought you might want to read it. I picked it up. I looked at it. It was a detailed physiological analysis of my responses over the past 3 weeks of sessions, tracking heart rate, cortisol, micromuscle tension, pupil response, breathing pattern. The report noted that across all sessions, including the first one, including the moment the Vreth officials had approached me in the corridor, my threat response had not registered what her equipment would classify as fear. It registered something else. She had labeled it in her report with a term from her own species' behavioral science, which the translator rendered as Active problem orientation under acute external pressure. At the bottom of the report, she had written a single line of analysis, in plain language. It read, "This species does not experience threat the way we do. They experience it as a problem to be solved." I sat with that for a moment. Then I looked at her and said, "That is a very accurate description," she said. "How long have humans been like this?" I said, "As long as we have been human, I think. We are not sure whether it came from the conflicts or before them. We suspect it is both." She looked at me with very large dark eyes, the Mur equivalent of careful attention. She said, "You frightened several members of this chamber today. Not with anything you said. With what I submitted. They read that a species exists that does not register fear under conditions that would cause any other species to seek safety. And several of them found that very difficult to process." I said, "I am not dangerous." She said, "I know that. Most of them know that too, intellectually. But knowledge and instinct are different." She paused. "You should understand that your presence here will be understood differently. Now. Not as provisional, not as developing, as something they do not yet have a category for." I thought about that. I said, "Good. Categories are limiting." She stood up, with some difficulty given the chair size, and she said, "I will continue my monitoring with your permission." I said, "You have it." She left. I sat alone in the empty chamber for a while, in the uncomfortable outer ring chair, looking at the high ceiling and the light moving through it. Then I took out my phone. It was a small, ordinary device, the same model I had been using for years, with a cracked corner on the screen that I had never gotten fixed because I kept forgetting to. I opened a message to Earth, to the department, to the people who had sent me here with a letter of appointment that said provisional and return. Transport that was officially still pending. I typed, "Seat secured, beginning phase 2. I sent it. Then I put the phone away and I sat in the quiet of the chamber that had, 3 weeks ago, voted to remove me from it, and I thought about what came next. Because there was always a what comes next. That is something I have understood since the very beginning of my career. Sitting in the first difficult room I ever sat in, watching people who thought they had won make the mistake of thinking that winning was the end of something. Winning is never the end of something. It is always only a new beginning. I thought about the 41 votes that had gone against Earth's restoration. 41 was a number, and numbers are not permanent. 41 people who had not yet been given a reason to decide differently. 41 conversations I had not yet had. I thought about the Oversight Committee, which was new and fragile, and would need to be protected from the very forces it was designed to constrain. I thought about the 9 species whose agreements were going to be renegotiated, who would need support through that process from someone who understood what it meant to negotiate from a position of less power against a party with more. I thought about Liravos and Pip Noor, and the old Vithani diplomat and the Sulhari representative who had been interrupted twice before, finishing her sentence in the very first session, and I thought about what it would take to make sure that never happened again. I thought about the Vreth, and Dross, and that expression on his face during the final vote, the one that looked like reassessment. I did not want him as an enemy forever. Enemies are expensive. I wanted him, eventually, as something more complicated and more useful than that. I wanted him to understand that the room had changed, and that changing rooms was not always a defeat, that sometimes it was the only way forward for everyone in them. I was 38 years old. I had been in the building for 3 weeks. I had changed the second ring seating assignment, created a new standing committee that had not existed before, opened 9 treaty renegotiations, and submitted physiological evidence into the cooperative's formal record that would be studied by xenobiologists across 12 species for the next several decades. Not bad for a man who vomited his way through hyperspace and sat in a chair with the wrong number of legs. I stood up. I straightened my jacket. I picked up my notebook. They called me a diplomat. The galaxy had called humanity primitive, developing, unstable, a species defined by its conflicts. What none of them had yet fully understood, though some of them were beginning to, was that for my species, those two things had never been opposites. The diplomat and the persistence, the patient voice and the absolutely unshakable refusal to be moved from the room. We had been both, always, since the very beginning. I walked out of the empty chamber into the wide corridor, where the light was still doing something almost beautiful, and I turned toward the observation deck, because the stars were there, and I wanted to look at them again. There was a great deal of work to do. I was looking forward to it.